Welcome to my channel. My name is Tanja and I'm happy to have you here. So today we're talking about sewing for beginners and how as a beginner you can really prevent your sewing from failing. Tip number 1 is to get patterns with proper instructions. Because yes, you can find out how something works by trial and error and you can test it until it works. However, it will always be easier to just find a pattern that explains a technique well, or finding a tutorial or how-to video on YouTube or a blog post, a sew-along, something like that. A piece of information you can hold on to that explains exactly how it's done professionally. So finding those amazing resources is really easy nowadays since we have indie patterns. So I'd really recommend you to choose an indie pattern for your first sewing projects. Indie patterns usually explain really well what you have to do in each step, and they explain it in a really beginner-friendly way. Like, they don't use any really technical terms. And last but not least, indie sewing patterns are usually designed in a really simple way. Even if you can make a more detailed or a more elaborate version of the same garment with more pattern pieces or more techniques, indie patterns usually try to use the minimum of techniques and pattern pieces and are really designed for beginners in terms of everything. So yeah, I'd really recommend you to use an indie sewing pattern. Tip number 2. If you already bought a pattern which is not an indie pattern, or if you have some indie pattern which you are still struggling with some steps, try to research and find out how those things are done properly before you try to sew them yourself. Like when you read the instructions and you don't know what you're supposed to do, just Google this step and try to find maybe an instruction with pictures or a video that shows you exactly what to do, and then you'll be able to understand much better what you're doing, and you are minimizing the risk of doing something wrong that might end up causing some damage on your fabric because you have to unpick something, or yeah, just you won't do as many things that you have to take apart later. So yeah, always for new techniques that the pattern doesn't explain, research how they're done. There are so many videos on the internet and blog posts and articles. You can find an explanation to everything. So yeah, just try to find one and stick to it. So tip number 3 is regarding fit issues. If you're not sure whether a garment will fit you well, or if you even made sure you cut the right size, still make sure that you put it on as often as you can. So after each step where you did a major change in the pattern, insert another pattern piece onto it, and you're able to try on the piece, try it on, see if it will still fit you. Especially before you join the sleeve with the bodice pieces, make sure the seam lies on the place it's supposed to lie, right here. Make sure the length of the sleeve is right before you attach any bands. Make sure the hemline is in the right place when you're sewing a top. And make sure when you're sewing trousers they have the right length. If you're not sure, then just add an inch or so at the beginning before you are cutting out your piece, and rather shorten them later. Don't ever just sew a garment straight like the instructions say. Most people do need some adjustments, and it's always easier to make them when you're in the process. When you have to alter something later, it's always more difficult. So just make sure you're trying on your pieces regularly to make sure they're still fitting, and to be able to change things that might not be fitting. Tip number 4. If you're working with a fabric that is really, really precious to you and that you're kind of afraid to mess up and to ruin when you're cutting into it, just put that fabric aside for a moment. First, make a trial. Either make a trial or use the fabric on a garment you already made before. But if you don't have such a garment, if you want to try a new pattern with that fabric, just make a trial. So it will give you the opportunity to first check if everything fits, make your adjustments, and then make sure that when you do the exact same thing with your precious fabric, that it will work, and it will make you much more confident. And sometimes it's just those like thoughts that we have whether something will work that will make us make a dumb mistake if we're too anxious and too nervous and like shaking because we could do something wrong. So just don't be nervous, and if you are nervous, then just make a trial to get over it. Another note on toiles: you can not only make toiles for whole garments, you can also make them on just parts of garments. So if, for example, you're making a sleeve placket for the first time and you're afraid of messing it up because you already finished the rest of the shirt and the only thing you have to do is the placket, just make a trial of how you insert the placket. Like, cut that part of the sleeve, like all the pieces you need for a placket plus the sleeves, and just cut it out of some scrap fabric and sew up that thing before you work on your final garment. So make a trial when you A, don't know if a garment will fit, or B, you want to practice a technique. That's like usually an overseen way to use trials. Tip number 5. What if you don't want to make a trial, but you still want to check if the garment will fit? Well, choose a garment out of your wardrobe that you know fits you well, out of the same category of garments. So if you want to test whether that sweater pattern will work, take a sweater out of your wardrobe and just place it on the pattern pieces. And then you can compare the measurements, and most likely your pattern pieces will be bigger than a sweater because they contain seam allowances. So make sure before you make the test that you have in mind what the seam allowance is. So you have to subtract that and then compare the measurements. Don't make the mistake to cut the pieces smaller and then in the end find out that you need some seam allowance and that you cut the wrong size. Yeah. So according to that test, either adjust the size and go one size up or down, or stay at the same size if you found that your pieces work, or do some adjustments like a full bust adjustment, a sway back adjustment, a narrow hip adjustment, full seat adjustment, whatever. There is a large amount of adjustments, and if you feel that you have problems with garments, usually in certain areas, like if you know you have a pretty full bust and you're always having too less space there, look into the adjustments. Just this knowledge and using this knowledge will make your garments fit a lot better. Tip number 5. We're now actually cutting out the pieces from your fabric. Make sure you're using the grain line marks on the pattern pieces and placing them exactly onto the actual grain line of the fabric. Because if you place them at any odd angle, your finished garment will distort and there will be wrinkles where no wrinkles should be. So if you don't want any funnily distorted garments, just make sure your grain line is always aligned with the actual grain line of the fabric. Tip number 6. Pick the right fabrics. So make sure the fabric you are using is working with what the instructions say on the back of the envelope. So if they say you need a lightweight drapey fabric, make sure you get a lightweight drapey fabric, because that drape is needed to make the pattern like work in the way it is presented on the front of the envelope. Make sure the amount of stretch that is needed is right for the pattern, and make sure that, especially for patterns that work with a variety of fabrics, like more drapey and not so drapey fabrics, that your fabric is right for what you want to create. Because even if a pattern might work with two kinds of fabrics, if you want to create the one result, you're not going to be happy if you have just fabric for the other. So for example, if your pattern is a hybrid out of a shirt and a blouse, let's take the Deer and Doe pattern, the Millilo blouse, as an example for that. They have one version sewn up as a blouse out of a lightweight drapey fabric, and the other version, which has more shirt character, they have made out of a crispier cotton fabric, which doesn't have as much drape. Of course, you can use both fabrics to sew up the pattern, however, you will have different results. So just make sure that you're imagination is aligned with your fabric choice. And last but not least, some tips about how to deal with when you should be failing, even if you made sure you followed all these tips and you got great instructions and you were pretty sure that your project would work out. Sometimes you just fail. You can't do anything about it. Failing is just a part of learning. Sometimes you have to fail to see that that way isn't possible and that you have to take another way. So rather than being discouraged by it, just take failing as another opportunity to grow and to realize that a way just doesn't work like you had planned. So yeah, don't get discouraged. I personally did fail on nearly every sewing project when I first started out. It wasn't so important to me because for me it was more about trying the projects and trying making and recreating the things I saw on Pinterest, and not about having a perfect garment. So yeah, I kept on going, I kept on sewing, I made a lot of stuff, and it's definitely gotten better. And if I had been discouraged, if I had stopped sewing after my first, 10 fails or so, all of this would have never happened. So yeah, it will definitely get better. Once you have realized that failing is just part of learning and that it happens and that it's nothing bad, you can analyze your facts. So sit down, pull out all of your makes that didn't go as you planned, and just try to find out what exactly went wrong in every case. So at the end you should end up with a list of things, and usually it's not just one another thing on every garment, but there's a tendency that you do this or that thing wrong, and you can narrow it down to a few things that you now have to incorporate to your sewing. So maybe it's you didn't get that technique wrong, you didn't get that technique wrong, you try to do that yourself. So the solution would be you have to research more, or you have to make a trial, practice the technique before you do it on the final garment. Whatever it is that was stopping you or is still stopping you from making perfect garments, just make sure that you know what exactly it is so you can work on it. So those were my top tips for succeeding at sewing and having less fails, and I really hope there was something in this video for you to take away and to make your sewing better and less frustrating. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because there will come lots more, especially for beginners, in the next months now. And if you want to see what I make in a more timely fashion than here on YouTube, follow me on Instagram. I'll post my recent makes there. Till then, happy sewing, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!